Tov, today's daf yomi is Bava Basra, daf Bava Basra 56. We're going to start on 55b, around 5 lines from the bottom, where Gemara says Avolah Shabbos lo. So basically, that Ravan had said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that when it comes to areas of Peah and Tumah, then we're going to say that a meitzar and a chatzav, a type of plant, are able to divide the field as relates to areas of tumah and also to the halachos of pay of a corner of a field. So the Gemara says avolah Shabbos, but with respect to Shabbos, Rabban is saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that it does not divide the field as relates to the laws of Shabbos, and we'll see what that means. Whereas Rava Amar Afilu Inyan Shabbos, Rava says even with respect to Shabbos, it divides the fields. So what is this referring to? So one of the 39 prohibitions of Shabbos, which is the last one of the 39 prohibitions in our counting of 39 prohibitions, is the prohibition of carrying on Shabbos an item the size of a grogeris, the size of a fig, from one domain to the other. And so this is like a dried up fig. So the Gemara brings a brisa where there's going to be a dispute between Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi with respect to carrying half a fig on Shabbos into one domain, and then remembering or forgetting, depending on the situation, and carrying it out a second half of fig. So that there's a dispute between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi. The Tanya, we learned in the brisa, let's say somebody forgot that today was Shabbos. He carried out half a fig, which is half of the responsibility to be liable to bring a sin offering. And he carried it out from his private domain or Shusaravan into the public domain. Now, if it had been a full fig, we'd have to bring a half a fig. But he forgot that it was Shabbos and he only brought out half a fig. And he left it in the public domain. And then he brought out another half a fig into the public domain, and he had not remembered in between that it was Shabbos. So chayev. So we're going to say, therefore, since it was the same, he'd still never remembered it was Shabbos. He's going to have to bring a sin offering under those circumstances. But if it was b'shnei alamos, he brought out the half a fig. He says, "Oh, it's Shabbos." Then he forgot that it was Shabbos again. He brought out another half a fig. Then he's going to be pater. Excuse me. Then he's going to be exempt. Whereas Rabbi Yossi is of the position that we're on top of Behelam Echad Bereshus Echad. Whereas Rabbi Yossi on the top of 56a is of the position that not only does it have to be one forgetting, it also has to be into one field, one domain of public. And then we're going to say, then he's responsible if it's one fig. But if he brought a half a fig into one field and a half a fig into the other field, he's not going to be responsible. Mishtei Rishayos Pater. And so in two domains, he's exempt. And so therefore, we're going to say that when Rabbi Yossi says we need to know the law as it relates to two fields with respect to Rabbi Yossi's halacha, because Rabbi Yossi says if it's two separate fields, you're not going to be chayev, even though it's one forgetting. And Rabba says, no, when do we say these are two separate fields? If there's a chiyuv chatos b'neihem, if in between the two fields of the public domain, there is an area that's a private domain, where if you carry from public domain into the private domain, you'd be responsible for carrying on Shabbos. But if it's just one field and it's not separated by a division where you're going to be liable for a sin offering by carrying in between, then we're going to say that under those circumstances, Rabbi Yossi would not say you're responsible to bring the sin offering. But if it's a carmelist, what's a carmelist? A carmelist is an area that's not a private domain or a public domain, it's in between. So then if that's in between the two fields, Rabbi Yossi would still consider it as one field. Rabbi Yossi would consider it as Rabbi Yossi would still consider it one field, and therefore you're going to be able to be chayev according to him. And so, hold on one second. And Abaye says, I feel carmelist. No, Abaye says even a carmelist which is going to be this area, which is 4 amos by 4, 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, and it's 3 tefachim high, then that's going to be a place where you would be considered technically a separation. Rabbi Yossi wouldn't say you're not responsible if you carried from one domain through a carmelis into the other domain of a pisla. But if it would be pisla, but if it would be just like a piece of wood or a place that less than 10 tefachim high, and it's not 4 tefachim wide, then it's not even going to then it's not going to be even considered to be a separation. And so therefore, even according to Rabbanan, since you're allowed to carry from it, and so therefore it's not going to nullify it's not going to be considered two separate fields according to Rabbi Yossi. Rava Amar Afilu Pisla. Rava says according to Rabbi Yossi, even this Pisla will be something that separates the fields because it's not going to be considered less than a border and a chatzav that Rava said earlier is going to divide the Rishuyos with respect to Shabbos. So therefore, the Rava with Tamei. Rava follows his logic. Because what was Rava's logic? Now, Rava Rishus Shabbos Rishus Gitin Dami. Rava says that the domains of Shabbos are similar in their laws to the domains of get, to the domains of a get. Meaning to say, in Mesechus Gitin, it was taught that if a woman is standing in her husband's courtyard, and her husband lends her the place in the courtyard in order so that she could acquire the get, and when he threw the get, it fell on a piece of wood that was in his courtyard. The law is that she's not divorced because the person isn't really lending two places. He's just lending out one place, the courtyard, not the pisla. And so therefore he didn't lend it to her. And so he didn't ever actually throw the get into her domain. And Rava says that just like by get, we're going to consider it its own place. And so therefore it's not nullified with respect to the courtyard. So too with respect to Shabbos, we're going to say it's considered like its own domain. So even though it's not like its own domain, nevertheless, it's going to nullify the two courtyards in between. And so therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi, if you carried it into half a fig into one and then a half fig into the other field, you're going to be considered to be like you're carrying on Shabbos and you're responsible. So it says, earlier we had said, that Rav Asi said, and Rav said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that this meitzar, this border, like this raised area, a little bit of a raised area, and this chatzav and this plant, they're going to divide between the two fields as it relates to the assets of a convert. Meaning to say, if you want to acquire the assets of a convert and you do a proprietary act in one of the fields, but if there's a separation of a chatzav or a meitzar in between two fields, you only acquire that field, you haven't acquired the other field of the convert. You need to do an act on each of the fields in order to acquire it. So the Gemara says, well, let's say Ein Shamu Meitzar V'lo Chatzav Mai. Let's say there isn't over there a border and there isn't this chatzav plant. What should you do? So Pirush Rabbi Marinus says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Shenikres Al Shmo. How are we going to know if it's going to be considered his field, one field or not, that allows you to acquire it? Anything that they call this the field of this person, since they're calling it that, it proves that they're separate fields, and therefore you need to, and therefore you're going to need to do this separate act of acquisition. It means say if you say this is his field and this is his field, so that's obviously two separate fields, and you're going to need to do the act of acquisition. But if you just say this is the field of this person, then one act would be sufficient. The Gemara says, give me an example of something that'll be considered that'll fall into this category. So the Gemara says, Amar Papa Dekarole Begargusa de Polanya. That the people call this field, this is the field of this person, and he irrigates it from his well. And so therefore, since he irrigates it from one well, it's considered to be like their one field. And therefore you do a proprietary act on one of them, it's like you've acquired the whole field. Yosef Rav Acha Bar Avia Kamed Rabbi Ami Yosef Kamar Mashmed Rabbi Asi Bar Chanina Chatzuva Ma'afsik B'Nechsei Ager. That this Chatzuva plant is going to be considered to be a divider in the assets of the convert. Meaning to say, if you have this Chatzuva plant between his fields and you acquire one of the convert's fields because the convert died with no relatives, and you acquire one of them, but since there was a chatzuva plant, you haven't acquired all of his fields. And my chatzuva, what is this chatzuva plant? And why do we say that it is considered enough to divide between the fields? So Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rab, Shabot Ticham Yeshua Yisrael Asa'aretz, because that is how Joshua divided up. That is how Joshua divided up the land of of Israel between the tribes, meaning to say that they would put this plant in between. And the reason is because this plant, its roots went straight down, and as a result of it, it didn't draw from another field. And so therefore, since they did it a division between the fields, it's considered to be like a separate division. 1 second. Okay, we continue. Baruch Hashem. So since the Gemara had brought the position of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rav that Joshua divide up the land of Israel with this chatzah, and the Gemara brings another teaching that Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav with respect to Joshua. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, Shua Ela Ayaros Haomdos Al Gvulin. Says when Joshua listed those cities in the book of Joshua, and we know it said earlier in our tractate back on 14b that Joshua wrote his book. He only listed those cities that were standing on the borders of the land because he wanted to show their specific borders. So it doesn't mean that he only listed the borders that are on the edge of the land of Israel, but rather he wants to state, it means to state that he's listing those borders that are those cities that are on the borders with other tribes. Okay. So now the Gemara continues to discuss the borders of the boundaries of the land of Israel, and basically with respect to obligating a tithe, and this is also related to our parsha this week. Amar Yehuna Mashmuel, Kol She'areu HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe. Like we saw in this past week's parsha, that Hashem said to Moshe, climb up to the mountain, Alei Rosh HaPesgav, V'sai Necha Yama V'tzafona, that look in all the directions. So wherever Moshe Rabbeinu was able to see when he died, Chayav b'Maiser, he's going to be obligated in the mitzvah of making a tithe on those crops. So as far as he could see, it's going to be obligated. Which cities were from the land of Israel was Rav Yehuda excluding and say that they're not obligated in Maiser? The Gemara says, money. This comes to exclude those lands of the peoples of the Keni, the Kenizites, and the Kadmoni, who were their land was promised to Avram Avinu in the covenant of the Brit Bein Tarim, and the Jewish people didn't only conquered 7 of the 10 nations that were promised to Avram. And so though in the future these cities will be given to us. And so therefore those lands will be exempt from Meiser once the Bnei Yisrael conquers them, or the lands that Moshe Rabbeinu was able to see. So Tanya, Rabbi Meir Omer. So who are these Keni, Kenizi, and Kanmoni? So Rabbi Meir says these are the Naftucha, the Naftucha, Arva, and Shalma. These nations are otherwise known as the Naftucha, the Arma, and the Shalma. These are commentaries say the Egyptians, the Ishmaelites, and the Canaanites. Rabbi Yehuda says Har Seir, Ammon, and Moab. These are the nations. Rabbi Shimon says Ardiskim, Asya, Aspamia. These refers to the people of Ardiskim. Asya, the commentaries say, is the Germanic lands, and Aspamia is Sfarad. So now we go on to the next Mishnah. So we know that there is a basic principle that witnesses that are trying to cause other people to lose money are called Edim Zomamim. There are false witnesses. Generally speaking, the punishment is just like they tried to do to you, they will be done to them. How are they declared Edim Zomamim? If the people come and impeach the witnesses themselves and they say they could not have testified because they were with us in a different place when it was time to give their testimony. So so let's say there are two witnesses who come along and they want to testify that the one who, let's say Reuben has the property, and they say Sha'acha Shalosh Shanim, and they say Reuben had his property for 3 years, and so therefore he's allowed to keep it. And then these two witnesses are found to be false witnesses because the other two witnesses come and say you were with us. Mishaman Lois called. Then they have to pay the person who owns the property the entire value of the property. That's a straightforward law about laws of testimony. But Shnayim Barishona, Shnayim Bishniya, Shnayim Bishlishi. So let's say two witnesses come and say Reuben had it the first year. And then another two witnesses come and say Reuben had it the second year. Another two witnesses come along and say Reuben had it the third year. Mishal Shin B'neim. So then we're on top of 56b. Then we say they each pay one of the years. We split into thirds because they only established the chazaka after 3 years. Let's say there are three brothers, and one person combines with each of them, meaning to say there are three brothers, Reuben, Shimon, and Levi, and Yehuda testifies with Reuben about year 1, Shimon about year 2, and Levi about year 3. Then this is going to be considered three separate testimonies, and they are one testimony for Hazama, meaning to say, if they are found to be Zilmamin, well, there's actually two explanations about how you understand this, but the Rashbam's explanation is if they're found to be Edim Zomamin, if two witnesses come and impeach all of these witnesses, then each of the Zomamin, then each of the witnesses, each of the brothers will have to pay basically a sixth of the property, and the additional witness would have to pay half. That's how Rashbam understands it. Tosfos understands it that they're one testimony for Hazama, that they don't have to pay anything unless all of them are impeached, because otherwise the person is not going to have the property unless they all testify. The Gemara says, our Mishnah who says that these three groups of witnesses can combine together to establish a chazaka and also for Edim Zomin is lo Rabbi Akiva. It's not like Rabbi Akiva did. Tanya Rabbi Akiva taught. We learned in the Bride. So I'm Rabbi Yossi. Kishalach Abba Chalafta. Rabbi Yossi is referring to Abba Chalafta, who will see that was his father's name. That Rabbi Yossi's name, his father's name was Chalafta. Because we know as a general rule, the Stam Rabbi Yossi in the Shas is Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta. That we know that Rabbi Yossi said when my father Abba Chalafta went to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Lomod Torah, and some say Rabbi Yossi said when Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri went to my father Abba Chalafta to study Torah, Amarlo Arei Sha'achal Shana Rishona Bifnei Shnayim, Shniya Bifnei Shnayim, Shlishis Bifnei Shnayim. Mao. They said, let's say the person who has the property, two witnesses come and said he had the first year in front of the first year, and then two other witnesses say he had the second year. And a third said he has the third year. Now, what will be the law? And then Abba Chalafta or Rabbi Yochanan Nuri, depending on the version of the story, said Harei zu chazaka, that this is indeed a chazaka. And Amar lo, and he responded, Afani Omer Kain. Rabbi Yossi said. So he said, I also say this, Rabbi Akiva holech b'davar zeh. Rabbi Akiva says that this is not going to be considered a chazaka. And so therefore our Mishnah is not going to be like Rabbi Akiva, because what does Rabbi Akiva say? Rabbi Akiva says, davar v'lo chatzi davar. Rabbi Akiva says on the basis of two witnesses or three witnesses, the matter should be established, and not on half of that matter. And so since it's testimony, each one is testifying only about a third of it, therefore, it's not enough to establish the entire evidence, and so therefore it's going to be disqualified. Rabbi Akiva seems to be arguing with our Mishnah. Rabbanan, so the Gemara asks the question, well, according to Rabbanan, who say it is enough to establish a testimony, when it says davar v'lo chatzi davar, when the pasuk says davar, the Brayso learns out from it You have to establish something on the basis of two witnesses, but not half of those witnesses. What would they establish it about? Means say, what did the Rabbanan use this with the verb davar? What do they say it refers to? If you want to say that if it's coming to exclude the case where two witnesses come, in order to establish a person that she was an adult, so that she's going to be responsible for being punished, let's say adultery, and one witness comes and says that you need to have two hairs, and one witness says that she has one hair on the front and one hair on in a different spot, and the Chachamim say that under those circumstances, we're going to say that there's not establishing her as two witnesses testifying that she's an adult, because each one is only testifying about one hair, meaning to say you need two witnesses to you need each witness to testify about two hairs. No, this is also not going to be considered to be half of the matter, because this is half of the testimony, because aside from the fact that each one is only testifying about one hair, which is half of the matter, it's also half of the testimony. It's chatzi edus, because each one of the hairs only has one witness about it. So it's not going to be sufficient. There isn't two witnesses on two hairs. And so therefore it's coming to exclude a case. It's coming to exclude a case where two witnesses say that there's a hair in one spot, and the other two witnesses say there's going to be a hair in the other spot. So therefore you have two witnesses on each part, on each hair. And so therefore the Rabbanan will say, on this case, it's not going to help, because it says that you need two witnesses on two hairs, not two witnesses on one hair and two witnesses on another hair. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. So now the Gemara says the following scenario. Let's say there are two witnesses that testify on the 3 years of the chazaka, but Echad Omer, one witness says, one witness says that the field was growing wheat, and the other one says the field was growing barley. That's going to be established as a proper testimony of chazaka. So in Maskefo Rav Nachman, if that's the case, El Me'ata, Echad Omer Acha Rishona Shlishis V'Chamishis, V'Echad Omer Acha Shnia Revi'is V'Shishis. Well, if that's the scenario, then if one witness testifies that this person, let's say Reuven, had the field for years 1, 3, and 5, and the other one says Reuven had it for years 2, 4, and 6, would you say that that's also going to be considered a chazaka? Each one of them is not testifying on 3 consecutive years. And so therefore, under these circumstances where one testifies wheat and then one testifies barley, we're going to assume that it wasn't the same year. And so therefore, they're not doing it 3 years in a row, and it shouldn't be a chazaka. So Amalei Rabbi Yehuda, no, that's two totally different cases. Hasan b'shated kamas and mar will kamas and mar. There they were obviously testifying about two separate times. Here they're both testifying about the same year. It's just one thought it was barley, one thought it was wheat. And clearly that's going to establish a chazak, because it's 3 years in a row. Just one person thought it was growing barley, one thought it was wheat. So the Gemara says, Michael Neymar, what's your assumption? Do you mean to say the assumption must be that people don't distinguish between whether it's growing wheat or whether it's growing barley? If you ask me what was growing in that field, I might say barley or I might say wheat. Either way, I'd be making it up, because I'm not really sure exactly how it grows, because I don't really know the difference. I know the guy's growing something. So therefore, that's why they're going to say that's the assumption. All right, we'll stop here. We're going to review this stuff at 8 o'clock, and then tonight, God willing, we'll get back into our regular routine with Hashem's help, Baruch Hashem. And everybody should have good to be back and studying with everybody. Everybody have a great day.